They said no man could survive. Not after what was done to him. In the dust of Dry Creek, a cowboy returned, his voice stolen by a bullet, his past buried in silence. He wasn't just broken. He was hunted, branded as an enemy by the very people he once tried to save. Yet on one frozen night, a sound rose faint in the storm hoofbeats, steady as a heartbeat refusing to die. Because sometimes it isn't the words we speak that save us. It's the courage carried in silence. They would later say Dry Creek changed forever on that one afternoon when a stranger rode in carrying silence deeper than the desert itself. A scar at his throat had stolen his voice, but not the story carved into his past. No one knew then that his arrival would awaken ghosts best left buried, or that his silence would carry the echo of a name feared across the plains. And if you've ever believed one man and one horse could alter the fate of an entire town, stay with this tale. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, so Dry Creek's dust might drift to your doorstep too. Dry Creek sat sunburnt and half forgotten at the edge of nowhere. The main street was a stretch of dirt, its boardwalks warped and weary. Wooden facades leaned forward as though eavesdropping on each passerby. The saloon doors groaned like old bones. The church steeple still reached skyward, but its bell had long since rusted silent. The air hung heavy, smelling of dust and horse sweat. Children's laughter faltered as they caught sight of the rider approaching from the horizon. Dogs barked and slunk back beneath porches. Men at the saloon straightened, eyes narrowing. In Dry Creek, new arrivals seldom meant salvation. His name was Luke Harland, 40 years old, though years of war had carved him older. He was tall but carried himself with a slight stoop, as if burdened by memories too heavy to shed. A jagged scar climbed across his throat, raw proof of why no word had crossed his lips since the day he was shot. His storm-gray eyes spoke in place of his voice eyes marked by grief, but unyielding in their watch. His coat, once fine, now hung faded and threadbare. Dust clung to his boots. He carried little, only a weathered satchel and a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside lay the one possession he guarded like breath itself, a wooden flute. Beside him walked Ghostwind, a silver-coated mustang, his mane lifting like smoke in the dry wind. The horse's amber eyes flicked toward every shadow, as if protecting the words his master could not speak. To the townsfolk, the animal's presence made the stranger seem larger than life, spectral half man, half myth. Luke dismounted at the watering trough. Ghostwind lowered his muzzle to drink, ripples breaking across the dusty water. Luke touched the brim of his hat in silent greeting. But the absence of words unsettled the crowd more than any threat might have. Silence, in Dry Creek, felt like guilt. "Too quiet," muttered a shopkeeper leaning against a barrel. "Mark my words, no good comes from a man who won't speak." The whisper crawled through the crowd, multiplying like weeds. Fugitive, maybe. Killer, more like. Eyes followed Luke with suspicion, sharp as drawn knives. And then she appeared, Maybelle Ortiz, 58, stout yet steady, with hair streaked black and silver pinned beneath a faded kerchief. Her apron bore smudges of flour. Her hands carried the permanence of work. 15 years earlier, she had buried her husband in the West Side Cemetery and taken in her only grandson, raising him on biscuits, coffee, and stubborn faith. Maybelle's breath caught as her gaze fell on Luke's saddlebag. A corner of carved wood jutted out from the cloth. Her heart lurched. She knew that flute. It had belonged to her husband, the same flute that once carried music into their summer nights. Inside the diner window, Tommy 12, skinny as a rail, freckles scattered like spilled grain across his nose, pressed against the glass. His blonde hair stuck up in cowlicks, his eyes wide with a boy's hunger for stories. He saw not danger, but wonder. To him, the stranger was no fugitive. He was a mystery, begging to be unraveled. Maybelle stepped down onto the boardwalk, her voice trembling yet fierce. "Mister, that flute, where did you come by it?" The street froze. Even the wind seemed to still. Luke turned, gray eyes steady. He drew the flute from its wrap with careful hands. Time had scarred the wood, but the carvings were unmistakable. Maybelle's throat tightened. It was her husband's. Luke lifted the instrument to his lips. The first note trembled, cracked with years of disuse. But then the melody found its breath. Low, haunting. aching. The song was the same one Maybelle's husband had played, drifting across twilight fields so long ago. The diner fell silent. Children stopped their games. Boots ceased to scuff the dirt. The music braided sorrow with confession, weaving a truth Luke could not speak aloud. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was heavier than before. Then a voice slithered from the crowd, harsh and accusing. "That tune. Jonas Callahan used to play it. If this mute knows it, he's tied to him, sure as sin." Gasps rippled. Faces turned. The name hung like a curse. Maybelle's heart thudded in her chest. Jonas Callahan, the man who had destroyed her family. Every eye in Dry Creek fixed on Luke, suspicion sharpening into fear. Luke stood motionless, the flute still clutched in his scarred hands, unable to answer, unable to defend himself. His silence weighed more than any confession could. The melody had not only revived a widow's grief, it had pulled the shadow of Jonas Callahan back into the heart of Dry Creek. And now the town believed the mute stranger carried the past in his blood. The last note of the flute still quivered in the air when the accusation struck like a whip. "If this mute knows that song, he's tied to Jonas Callahan." Gasps rippled through the street. Faces darkened, suspicion sharpening into something dangerous. Maybelle Ortiz felt her stomach twist. The name was one she had hoped never to hear again. She stepped forward, cutting through the whispers, her voice firm but edged with unease. "Enough. This man comes with me." Her words didn't erase doubt from the crowd, but in Dry Creek no one argued with Maybelle when her jaw was set like stone. She turned sharply, gesturing toward the diner. Luke Harland, the mute stranger, followed without protest, his boots heavy on the boards. Ghost wind stamped outside, restless, while Maybelle shut the door behind them, cutting off the town's prying eyes. Inside, the diner was warm with lamplight but thick with tension. Shadows stretched across the scarred wooden tables. A kettle hissed faintly on the stove, the sound brittle against the silence. Maybelle kept her back straight, apron still dusted with flour from the day's work. She faced Luke with the hard eyes of a woman who had buried too much to be easily swayed. "Sit," she said. Luke lowered himself into the chair in the corner, his broad shoulders hunched, his hat brim shadowing the scar on his throat. His silence pressed heavy in the room, thicker than any words. From the hallway crept a thin figure, Tommy, Maybelle's 12-year-old grandson. His sandy blonde hair was a mess of cowlicks, his freckles scattered across his nose like summer dust. He was a wiry boy, restless and eager, carrying the unshaken belief that every stranger might be a story waiting to unfold. He tiptoed closer, wide eyes fixed on Luke. "Gran," he whispered. "Is he bad?" "Hush," Maybelle snapped, but the boy lingered, curiosity outweighing fear. Luke reached into his satchel and drew out a scrap of paper and a worn pencil. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed the lead down, each stroke slow, crooked, and deliberate. Maybelle watched every move, suspicion tightening her chest. Tommy edged closer until he could peer over Luke's arm. The words appeared uneven, jagged, but legible. "I am not your enemy." The boy's face lit up. "Gran, look! He's telling us he's good." Luke raised his eyes, gray and tired, to meet the boy's grin. For a heartbeat, the hardness in them softened. There was gratitude in that look, and something Tommy would later think of as kindness. But Maybelle was not a child, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen men swear they meant no harm only to leave blood and ruin behind. She wasn't ready to accept words, especially written words, from a stranger who carried her dead husband's flute. Luke bent again, the pencil pressing deeper into the page this time. His hand shook, but he wrote on, slower now, as if every letter cost him strength. When he slid the paper forward, Maybelle leaned in. Her eyes widened. The letters were crude, but there was no mistaking them. Jonas Callahan. The sound of the kettle seemed to vanish. Maybelle's throat closed, her breath sharp. That name was Poison Jonas, the man who had stripped her family of their land, crushed her husband's spirit, and left debts and bitterness like scars across her life. Her hands curled into fists, knuckles white. "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Why write that name?" Tommy looked between them, confused. "Gran, who's Jonas Callahan?" Maybelle turned sharply. "Not now, Tommy." Her chest heaved with the weight of memory. She had protected the boy from the darker truths of their past. Jonas Callahan's name was not one spoken lightly in Dry Creek. Her gaze snapped back to Luke. He sat still, his eyes steady, but offered no explanation. The scar at his throat sealed any defense he might have given. His silence roared louder than words. Fear clawed at Maybelle's ribs. What if the townsfolk were right? What if this stranger with his ghostly horse and her husband's flute was tied to Jonas? What if she had just welcomed danger into her home? Her hand shook as she lifted the paper again, staring at those two words like a wound reopened. Her voice broke into a whisper. God help me. What have I done? The paper still trembled in Maybelle Ortiz's hand. The name carved into it like a wound reopened. Jonas Callahan. Her pulse thudded in her ears, fear and memory choking her. Across the room, Luke Harland sat motionless, his storm-gray eyes steady but unreadable. He offered no explanation, only silence. Tommy, wet-eyed with curiosity, hovered close to him. To the boy, the mute stranger was not danger, but mystery. To Maybelle, he was a risk she might already regret. Before she could gather her thoughts, a sudden cry shattered the tense quiet. "Gran!" Tommy's voice cut short, then nothing. Maybelle's heart lurched. She raced to the back door, Luke already rising with a force that toppled his chair. Out in the yard, the lantern's light spilled across the old stone well. The bucket rope swayed wildly. Tommy was gone. "Tommy!" Maybelle screamed, rushing forward. A faint splash answered, then frantic splashing below. Luke's boots pounded across the dirt. He dropped to his knees at the rim of the well, peering into the black. The boy thrashed in the water far below, hands clawing at the slick walls. Luke seized the rope tied to the post. It was rotten with age, frayed from years of disuse, but it was all he had. Without a sound, he looped it around his waist. He couldn't call for help. His ruined throat allowed only a guttural rasp. He could only act. Bracing himself, he slid down the stone wall, scraping his arms and legs until the cold water closed around him. Maybelle leaned over the edge, lantern shaking in her grip. Its glow flickered down the shaft, catching on Luke's shoulders as he fought the water. With a surge of strength, he hooked his arm around Tommy's chest and hauled the boy above the surface. "Hold on!" Maybelle cried, though her words could not reach him with any plan. Luke kicked against the stone, pushing upward, straining against the rotten rope. Water slapped his face, but he did not let go. Inch by inch, he lifted Tommy until Maybelle reached down, pulling with desperate hands. At last, the boy spilled over the rim, coughing and sputtering into her arms. Luke clambered after, dripping and gasping, his scarred throat heaving with effort. He collapsed beside them on the dirt, water pooling around him. Tommy coughed hard, then looked up at Luke with wide, shining eyes. "I knew it," he whispered hoarsely. "You're not a bad man." Luke's eyes softened. For a fleeting moment, his silence was gentler, his gaze carrying the words he could not say. He pressed a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder. Maybelle stood over them, lantern shaking. Her breath came ragged. The man she feared might be tied to her worst enemy had just saved the life of her only grandson. Doubt tangled with gratitude, suspicion with awe. Then came the sound that froze her blood. Hoofbeats, not one horse, but many. The rumble grew louder, the glow of torches appearing beyond the gate. The night air filled with the sharp snort of stallions and the creak of leather saddles. Luke turned his head, eyes narrowing. Ghost wind, tied at the post, stamped and tossed his silver mane, ears pinned back in alarm. From the darkness rode a cluster of men. Their leader swung down first, a broad-shouldered brute with a jagged scar across his cheek. His beard was thick, his eyes cold and vicious. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who knew fear followed him everywhere. His name was Cutter. 35, violent and cruel, he was one of Jonas Callahan's most loyal hounds. "Well, well," Cutter sneered, his voice low and gravelly. "Heard there's a mute stranger sniffing around Dry Creek. Thought we'd see him for ourselves." Behind him, half a dozen riders dismounted, shadows looming in the torchlight. Their boots crunched over the dirt as they spread out across the yard. Maybelle stepped forward, holding the lantern high though her hands shook. "You've no business here," she said, her tone iron though her stomach turned. Cutter's grin widened. "Lady, when Jonas Callahan wants to know something, we make it our business. Now." His gaze cut to Luke, dripping wet, his chest still heaving. "That the mute everyone's been whispering about?" No one answered. The only sound was Ghost Wind's restless pounding hooves. Cutter stepped closer, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. Best hand him over. You don't want trouble? Luke stood, his tall frame casting a dark shadow. He met Cutter's stare without flinching. His silence itself was defiance. Maybelle's breath caught. The world narrowed to one terrible choice: the man who had just saved her grandson's life, or the wrath of Jonas Callahan's men if she refused. Her heart thundered as she clutched the lantern tighter. The flame flickered wildly, mirroring the storm inside her. Cutter's men closed in, eyes glinting with menace. And Maybelle stood frozen, forced to decide betray the mute cowboy who had just saved her family or protect him against the wolves of Jonas Callahan. The silver barrel of Jonas Callahan's revolver gleamed in the lamplight, pressed steady toward Tommy's pale face. The boy clutched Maybelle's apron, his breath shallow, wide eyes flicking from the weapon to Luke Harland. Maybelle's lantern shook in her hand, throwing frantic shadows across the diner's wooden walls. Outside, Ghostwind's hooves thundered against the ground, the mustang fighting the rope with violent jerks as though he too sensed the danger choking the room. For a single heartbeat, the world hung in silence. Then Jonas's smile curved, cruel and deliberate. So, Harland, you still think you can save anyone? Or has the bullet I gave you stolen more than just your voice? Luke's body stiffened. His throat tightened around the scar, a pain that never left, but his storm-gray eyes never wavered. He took one step forward, not a sound leaving his lips. His silence itself carried defiance. Maybelle's chest heaved. The truth carved itself clear now. Luke wasn't some wandering outlaw who stumbled into Dry Creek. He was the man who had once dared to fight Jonas Callahan, and he had paid the price with his voice. Jonas's laugh cracked through the room. That's right. I remember the night in Silver Creek. You stood against me, one man against an empire. Thought your courage meant something. He leaned closer, pressing the revolver's muzzle harder against Tommy's temple. The boy whimpered, his knuckles white as he clung to his grandmother's apron. But courage without power? That's just suicide. Stop it! Maybelle cried, her voice raw. She pulled Tommy tighter to her side, tears burning her eyes. If you want blood, take mine. Leave the boy. Jonas tilted his head, the cruel amusement never leaving his eyes. I've already taken enough from you, haven't I, Maybelle? Your land, your peace, your husband's life ground down by debt. And now, he flicked his gaze to Luke. Perhaps I'll take the last of your illusions, too. Luke moved another step forward, fists clenched at his sides. His chest rose and fell, the tension inside him like a storm straining to break. He couldn't speak, he couldn't beg, but every line of his body screamed a single vow: not the boy. Cutter shifted uneasily at the door, his scar catching the torchlight. Boss, he muttered, maybe this ain't... Jonas cut him off with a sharp glare. Shut your mouth, Cutter. I don't pay you to think. The gang fell silent again, their eyes darting nervously between the mute cowboy and their ruthless leader. Maybelle's mind raced. In Chapter 2, she had feared Luke's silence meant danger. In Chapter 3, she had seen him risk his life to pull Tommy from the well. Now, in this suffocating room, she finally saw the truth. He had always been danger, but not to them, to Jonas. Her voice trembled as she whispered, half to herself, half to God. He was the only one who ever fought you. Jonas's smirk widened, hearing her. Exactly. And look at him now. A broken relic. Cursed to choke on his own silence. Do you really think this man can save you? Luke's hands trembled. The scar on his throat burned. He wanted to scream, to roar, to drive Jonas back with the voice stolen from him. But nothing came. Only the sound of ghost wind outside slamming against the post, the mustang's cry cutting through the night like a warning trumpet. Tommy's voice broke the tension. He saved me, the boy said suddenly, voice small but fierce. He went down the well. He pulled me out when I would have drowned. He's not broken, Jonas sneered. Children believe in fairy tales. Men believe in guns. He cocked the revolver, the click echoing like a death knell. Maybelle lunged forward, her lantern swinging. Please, she begged. I'll do anything. Just let the boy go. Jonas shoved her back with his free hand. The lantern clattered to the floor, its flame sputtering dangerously close to the wood. Shadows leapt and twisted, painting the room in frantic strokes of light and dark. Luke's breath came hard. The sight of Maybelle falling, the sound of Tommy's ragged sobs, the sneer on Jonas's face, all of it twisted inside him, forcing pressure against the silence that had bound him for years. His fists shook as though every nerve in his body fought to find release. Jonas leaned down, his words a hiss. "Time's up, Harland. Do something, or watch this boy die." Maybelle dragged herself up, her eyes burning into Luke's. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. "Do something." Luke's gaze met hers. His silence wasn't weakness now. It was a fuse, sparking, ready to ignite. Jonas's finger curled tighter on the trigger. The revolver pressed into Tommy's hair. The boy squeezed his eyes shut. Ghost wind screamed outside, hooves striking fire from the dirt. And Luke Harland stepped forward into the line of fire, his storm-gray eyes blazing, the moment of reckoning at last upon him. The muzzle of Jonas Callahan's revolver pressed hard against Tommy's temple. The boy's eyes squeezed shut, his lips trembling in silent prayer. Luke Harland stepped forward, shoulders squared, storm-gray eyes locked on the man who had stolen his voice. Maybelle's scream still echoed in the rafters, a mother's cry not for her own life, but for her grandson's. Ghost wind shrieked outside, hooves tearing furrows in the dirt, desperate to break free. Jonas's finger tightened on the trigger. The silence inside the diner cracked into shouts, the crash of overturned chairs, the sharp bark of orders from Cutter's men outside. And then chaos erupted. The door slammed open as Ghost Wind ripped free from the post, silver mane wild, eyes ablaze. The Mustang lunged into the room with a force born of fury, crashing against one of the armed men at Jonas's side. Wood splintered. A lantern tumbled. Bullets roared. Luke moved like lightning. He grabbed a piece of chalk from the shelf kept there for Maybelle's menu board and dragged it across the nearest plank. The words came jagged, furious, carved by desperation. "Protect the boy." Tommy's eyes flew wide at the message, and Maybelle, heart pounding, shoved him under the heavy oak table just as the first bullet shattered glass. Jonas's laughter cut through the din. "You think chalk will save them, Harland? You think words matter when guns speak louder?" But then came the twist no one expected. For years, Luke's throat had been a prison. But as Tommy scrambled to obey the scrawled command, a raw cry surged from Luke's chest, clawing its way past scar and silence. It tore out of him ragged, broken, but real. "Tommy down!" The boy ducked just as Jonas fired. The bullet screamed overhead, slamming into the wall. Gasps filled the room. For the first time since that night in Silver Creek, Luke Harland had spoken. His voice, fractured and guttural, filled the diner like thunder. Maybelle's eyes filled with tears. She had prayed for proof, for a sign, and here it was. Not polished words, not a speech, but a cry of courage to save a child. The shootout engulfed the room. Ghost Wind kicked back at a gunman, sending him sprawling. Cutter drew his weapon, snarling, and fired. The bullet grazed Luke's shoulder, spinning him against the counter. Pain flared hot, but Luke gritted his teeth, reaching for a fallen pistol on the floor. Jonas barked orders, his silver Colt flashing in the lamplight. "Kill the mute! Leave the woman alive, she'll learn what loyalty costs." Luke fired back, the report deafening, the recoil jolting through his arm. One of Jonas's men fell, clutching his chest. Maybelle snatched a shotgun from beneath the counter, her hand steady despite the storm inside her. She racked it and fired, the blast shaking the walls, scattering wood and glass. Through the smoke, Luke's eyes found Tommy, crouched under the table, staring at him with awe. That single look fueled him more than any bullet. He kept shooting, each round a shield, each motion screaming what his voice could not. "I will protect you." Jonas ducked behind an overturned chair, teeth bared. He shouted over the roar. "I should have finished you that night, Harland. You'll die choking on silence." But Luke answered with action. He vaulted the counter, rolled across the floor, and fired again, his bullet grazing Jonas's arm. The outlaw cursed, clutching the wound, rage boiling in his eyes. The battle raged in seconds that felt like hours. Ghostwind trampled another gunman, sending his revolver spinning across the floor. Cutter lunged, blade flashing, but Luke met him head-on. The knife sliced across Luke's sleeve, drawing blood, but he slammed Cutter against the wall with brutal force. The man collapsed, stunned. Then came the moment that would echo forever. Jonas rose from behind cover, his revolver raised, his smile dripping with venom. He aimed not at Luke this time, but at Maybelle. Luke's heart stopped. The world narrowed to that silver barrel. Time slowed, sound dulled, but his instinct screamed, With a surge of raw will, he hurled himself forward, voice ripping free again, louder, clearer. "No!" The shot thundered. Luke's shoulder exploded with pain as the bullet tore through, but he didn't falter. He crashed into Jonas, driving him to the floor, fists slamming with years of fury. The revolver clattered away. Jonas grunted, rolled, clawed for his weapon. Luke's body shook, bleeding, breath ragged, but he pressed down, refusing to yield. The room was chaos, shouts, gunfire, the clash of bodies. But at its center, two men fought not just for survival, but for the soul of Dry Creek. Then, with one last heave, Jonas staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his lip. He stumbled back, revolver miraculously still in his hand. He aimed again, wild and desperate. Jonas fell to one knee, chest heaving, his revolver wavering but still cocked. His eyes locked on Maybelle, even beaten, even bleeding, his finger curled on the trigger, the gun steady at her heart. The revolver in Jonas Callahan's hand shook, wavering though his finger still pressed the trigger. His eyes, blazing with rage, locked on Maybelle Ortiz. Across the diner, Luke Harland bled from his shoulder, his chest heaving, yet his storm-gray gaze never left the outlaw. Ghost Wind reared outside, screaming, as though sensing the last fatal heartbeat of the fight. The shot rang out. But it wasn't Maybelle who fell. Ghost Wind barreled through the doorway, chestnut body striking like thunder. The Mustang's flank took the bullet meant for Maybelle, the sound of impact muffled in his cry. His powerful body crashed into Jonas, knocking him off balance, sending the outlaw sprawling across the floor. "Ghost Wind!" Tommy screamed, scrambling from beneath the table. The boy's small hands reached toward the horse as Maybelle grabbed him back, her eyes wide with horror and gratitude. Jonas rolled to his knees, teeth bared, fury spilling like poison. "That horse should have died with you, Harland." He raised the revolver again, his hand trembling, his arm slick with blood. Luke staggered, his shoulder screaming with pain. Yet in that instant, something rose inside him that had lain buried for years. He gripped the pistol in his own bloodied hand, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The report split the room. Jonas Callahan jerked backward, his revolver clattering from his fingers as he collapsed to the floorboards. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by the ragged breaths of those left standing. Ghost Wind staggered, his chest rising and falling, his legs quivering. He sank to his knees, sides heaving with exhaustion, blood streaking his flank where the bullet had lodged. Maybelle knelt beside him, tears spilling. "You brave soul. You saved me." Around them, Cutter and the surviving men slipped into the night, fear scattering them like leaves in a storm. Without their leader, the gang dissolved, leaving only the wreckage of the battle behind. Luke lowered his weapon, his hand trembling. His storm-gray eyes softened as he dropped to one knee beside Ghost Wind, pressing a hand to the Mustang's neck. For the first time in years, words trembled free, hoarse, broken, but clear. "Brother? Hero." The horse whinnied faintly, eyes closing as though in understanding. Tommy, cheeks streaked with tears, crawled into Luke's arms. "You spoke again," he whispered, awestruck. "I heard you. You saved us." Luke pressed a hand to the boy's hair, emotion tightening his throat more than any scar. The townsfolk, drawn by the gunfire, crowded at the door and windows. Murmurs rippled through them. The Mute Cowboy fought for us. The Mustang saved Maybelle Ortiz. Heroes, both of them. A woman's voice called out, trembling, "That horse, he's no ordinary beast." "He's the hero of Dry Creek." Maybelle rose, her face streaked with soot and tears, her eyes never leaving Luke. Something deeper than gratitude flickered there, a recognition that had grown from suspicion to belief. "Luke," she whispered, voice breaking. "I was blind before. I thought you were danger, but you were the only man who ever stood against him." Luke turned to her, lips parting. Straining against his scars, he forced sound into the air. Hoarse, fragile words formed. "Sister!" Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Maybelle's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling again. "Sister." The word carried more than blood. It carried truth. Luke Harland was not a stranger at all, but the lost brother of her late husband, a man believed gone in the years of violence Jonas had wrought. Maybelle reached for him, grasping his good arm, anchoring him as her body shook. "All this time," she said, voice trembling, "you were family." Tommy looked between them, eyes wide. "Then, he's my uncle?" Luke's lips curved, faint but real, and he nodded. The townsfolk stepped back, letting the family breathe. No one questioned it. No one doubted. Dry Creek had seen enough blood to know when truth spoke louder than words. The dawn crept in through the shattered windows, the first light gilding the dust that still hung in the air. Maybelle helped Tommy to his feet, her hand firm on Luke's back as he struggled to rise. Ghostwind, though wounded, pushed himself upright, staggering but refusing to fall. The boy rushed to the Mustang's side, hugging his neck. "You're a hero too," Tommy whispered. Ghostwind nickered faintly, lowering his head to the child. By the time the sun broke fully over the horizon, the town of Dry Creek had gathered. They helped bind Ghostwind's wound, brought water, steadied Luke's bleeding shoulder. Word spread fast. The Mute Cowboy was no longer mute, the horse had saved Maybelle, and Jonas Callahan's reign of terror was ended. The sheriff, arriving late with his deputies, surveyed the scene and nodded grimly. "Justice has been done here tonight," he said, tipping his hat toward Luke. "Not by the law, but by courage." Luke stood with Maybelle and Tommy, Ghostwind resting against him. His voice would never be whole again, but in the pale morning he managed broken syllables, enough for the town to hear. No more. Silence. And so it was. In the golden light of dawn, the four of them, Luke, Maybelle, Tommy, and Ghostwind, stepped together out of the diner's battered doorway. Behind them lay ashes and ruin. Ahead stretched a street washed clean by morning sun. The townsfolk parted to let them pass, their eyes filled not with suspicion, but with faith. For the first time in years, Dry Creek no longer felt like a place swallowed by silence. It breathed again, full of hope. Sometimes silence carries more truth than 1,000 words. Luke's journey showed us that even a broken voice can roar with courage when it rises to protect what truly matters. In the strength of a widow, the trust of a child, and the loyalty of a Mustang, Dry Creek discovered something greater than victory over an outlaw. It found hope, and the reminder that family is not only bound by blood, but by love and sacrifice. And now, dear friends, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from tonight? Share it in the comments. Let's keep this circle of voices alive. If this tale touched your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey waiting just beyond the horizon.